I knew John Witte Jr. when he was a very bright and serious and studious philosophy major at Calvin College during the time when I was teaching there. After distinguishing himself as a really outstanding student at Calvin, went on to Harvard University, and in recent years has served at Emory University as the Jonas Robicher Professor of Law and the Alonzo L. McDonald Distinguished Professor and Director of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. He has distinguished himself as a serious scholar looking at the intersection of the history of law, marriage law, biblical thought, religious liberty, has published 180 articles, 23 books, and a number of edited symposia. And I've followed his career since then with great interest and a little bit of pride, I've got to say. And when I found out that he would be in Southern California lecturing both at Pepperdine University and at Westminster Theological Seminary, I thought that he needed a good shot of broad evangelicalism, and so decided that I would invite him here, and I was so pleased that he was able to respond favorably to the invitation to be with us. So please join me in welcoming Professor John Witte Jr., who...
Well, thank you so much, President Mao, for that very warm and generous introduction. Good afternoon to each of you. It's wonderful to be at this Hall of Evangelical Learning under the great direction of your great President, Rich Mao. I want to say a word of commendation and admiration for Professor Mao, who has been one of the pioneers in the leadership of higher education in bringing the gospel to bear on fundamental questions of society, of culture, and doing it at a level of sophistication and with a wisdom predicated on scripture and tradition that's unrivaled in the world. And you should be very proud of having him as your teacher, as I am very proud to have had him as my teacher. And it's an honor to be with you, my friend, and to have the privilege of standing at a lectern that you no doubt have built.
Why don't you just repeat that?
It's good to see all of you. I recognize a number of names and a number of faces, and it's wonderful to be in this distinguished audience. And it's also very, very intimidating for a mere law professor of slow wit and small imagination to be standing in front of a distinguished seminary audience, experimenting with some new ideas that I'll be trying out on biblical understandings of covenant and their enduring providence for issues of marriage and family today. As I was driving up here from Westminster Seminary, where I did induce a couple of smiles amongst the Presbyterians this morning, I could not help but remember the rather embarrassing experience of my good friend Brian in our first-year class in contracts together some 30-odd years ago when I was a fledgling law student. And the class was taught by the Venerable Archibald Cox of Watergate fame, a master of Socratic dialogue and repartee. Brian was a particularly gifted student. He had been trained in rhetoric and drama at Harvard. He had been a national debating champion. He had been a professional actor, even appearing in a part in a play on Broadway before law school. And so when Professor Cox called on Brian to recite the first case of the day in contracts, Brian initially held forth with considerable aplomb. Cox, of course, had only begun his interrogation. He began to press his line of questions a bit more closely, and Brian found that the answers did not fall nearly so easily off his tongue. Cox became even more insistent, now lashing out his Socratic whip with increasing alacrity and increasing accuracy. Brian became more and more confused. Cox became even more insistent. And finally, when the questions threatened to overwhelm him, Brian summoned up the little courage he had left, pulled himself up, looked Professor Cox straight in the eye, and repeated a line from his drama days. "Sir, I am afraid I am teetering on the edge of the abyss of my ignorance. Cox's reply was instantaneous. Young man, you fell into that abyss some time ago. Well, standing in front of this distinguished seminary audience, I too feel like I'm teetering on the edge of the abyss of my ignorance, and I shall leave it to my teacher to declare when I have fallen in. The title of my lecture this afternoon is The Covenant of Marriage, Its Biblical Roots, Historical Influences, and Modern Uses. And in good Trinitarian form, I'd like to divide my remarks into three parts. First, I'd like to take you on a brief tour of a new movement in modern American family law, the movement of covenant marriage, which is emerging as an alternative to contract marriage. Second, at the risk of malpractice, I want to spend some time leisurely strolling through the biblical architecture of covenant as it pertains to marriage. And then third, I want to return to our modern day and try to show you how a biblical phenomenology of covenant marriage still has enduring pertinence for us in church, state, and society alike, even in a pluralistic society which is dedicated to no establishment of religion by law. I promise you 46 and a quarter minutes, and then we can have some time for Q&A. On August 15, 1997, the state of Louisiana put in place America's first modern covenant marriage law. The law creates a two-tier system of government, of marriage. Couples may choose a contract marriage with minimal formalities of formation and attendant rights to unilateral no-fault divorce, or couples may choose a covenant marriage with more stringent formation and dissolution rules. The licensing costs for either form of marriage are the same, but in order to form a covenant marriage, the parties must receive detailed premarital counseling. They must wait for at least 6 months after their engagement. And they must swear an oath pledging, quote, full knowledge of the nature, purposes, and responsibilities of marriage and promising to love, honor, and care for one another as husband and wife for the rest of our lives. Divorce is allowed such covenant couples only on grounds of serious fault, adultery, capital felony, malicious desertion, or chronic abuse of spouse or child, or after 2 years of separation. Comparable covenant marriage statutes are now in place in Arizona and Arkansas as well. 29 additional states have had covenant marriage laws under consideration, though, as I'll explain at the end of my talk today, the movement has lost a good bit of momentum for now for a couple of good reasons. These new covenant marriage laws are designed in part to help offset the high costs of America's experiment with a private contractual model of marriage. Historically in America and in much of the West, marriages were presumptively permanent commitments, and marriage formation and dissolution were serious public events. Marriage formation required the consent of parents and peers, the procurement of a state certificate, the publication of banns, and a public ceremony and celebration after an ample period of waiting and discernment. Marriage dissolution required public hearings, proof of serious fault by one party, alimony payments to the dependent spouse, and ongoing child support, which would continue throughout the ex-spouse's lifetime. In the past 4 decades, many of these traditional rules have given way to a private contractual model of marriage grounded in new cultural and constitutional norms of sexual privacy and liberty and autonomy. Marriage formation rules have been simplified to require only the acquisition of a marriage license followed by solemnization, with no banns, no waiting, no public celebration, no notice to anyone else. Marriage dissolution rules, in turn, were simplified through the introduction of unilateral no-fault divorce. Either the husband or the wife could now file a simple suit for divorce. No fault by either party would need to be proved or staged. Courts would often offer a one-time division of marital property, privately negotiated by the couple, to give the parties a clean break to start their married and sexual lives anew. America's experiment with simple contractual marriage and sexual privacy has failed on many counts, with women and children bearing the principal costs. Some raw numbers provide us with perspective. From 1975 to 2005, roughly 1/4 of all pregnancies were aborted. 1/3 of all children were born to single mothers. 1/2 of all marriages ended in divorce. More than 2/3 of all African American children were raised without a father present. Mother-only homes had 3 times the rates of foreclosure or eviction, 4 times the rates of bankruptcy. Teenagers who grew up in broken homes proved 3 times more likely to have behavioral, learning, and socialization problems than teenagers from 2-parent homes. Fully 80% of all serious American felons convicted since 1975 have come from single or no-parent homes. Covenant marriage laws have been one of several legal responses to these mounting social and psychological costs of America's experiment with easy-in, easy-out contract marriage. Covenant marriage laws allow prospective marital couples to contract out of the state's laws of contract marriage and contract into the state's laws of covenant marriage. The choice of marital form is theirs, but having the choice encourages inaptly matched couples to discover their incompatibility before marriage rather than after it. If Jack and Jill march up to the marriage registry and Jack wants a contract marriage and Jill a covenant marriage, the disparity in prospective commitment should be too plain for them to ignore. Couples should delay their wedding until their mutual commitment has deepened, or cancel their wedding if their respective commitments remain disparate. Better to prepare well for a marriage than to rush into it. Better to cancel a wedding than to divorce shortly thereafter. Such is the theory of these new covenant marriage laws. Covenant marriage laws are not only a new form of social engineering designed to counter the rise of privatized marriage and no-fault divorce. They are also a new forum for the expression of traditional teachings that marriage is more than a mere contract. In the Western legal tradition, marriage has long been regarded as a natural, if not a spiritual estate, a useful, if not an essential association, a pillar, if not the foundation of civil society. Marriage has accordingly required much more than simple rules of private contract. It has drawn to itself special rules and complex rituals of betrothal and espousal, of registration and consecration, of consent and public celebration. It has also provided the basis for a long series of special rights and duties of husband and wife, parent and child, that are respected at both public and private law alike. This traditional legal teaching that marriage is more than a mere contract is rooted in part in ancient biblical teachings, and particularly the idea that marriage is a covenant has deep biblical moorings, which I'd like to spend a bit of time excavating together. You distinguished theologians know much better than I that the idea of covenant is prominent in the Bible. The term covenant and its derivatives appears a total of 312 times in the Bible. 46 of those references tie covenant to marriage. And almost all of these 46 references appear in the writings of 5 Hebrew prophets, Hosea, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Malachi, who collectively wrote from the mid-8th to the mid-5th centuries BCE, that tumultuous time before, during, and after Israel's exile to Babylon. Each of these prophets analogized the covenant relationship between God and Israel, promised to Abraham and forged by Moses at Sinai, to the marital relationship between a husband and a wife. Each of these prophets impute rather graphic emotions to God, the metaphorical husband, as he moves through the stages of forming and maintaining a covenant marriage with his chosen metaphorical bride Israel, and then watching that marriage unravel through Israel's idolatry, which is analogized to adultery. The prophets repeatedly depict God wistfully recounting his new love for his chosen bride. Early on, the prophets report God makes a promise to her metaphorical father Abraham that he will take Israel as his chosen bride when she comes of age. God spends time getting to know her, lavishing her with special gifts and favors, prizing her virtues and values, protecting her and liberating her from the enemies during their protracted time of courtship. After stating the terms of the marital covenant and the blessings and curses that will befall them as they live for better or for worse, God then seeks the consent of his chosen people Israel. And finally, in a dramatic ceremony presided over by Moses, God and Israel swear their covenant oaths to each other publicly, announcing to the world their new agreement and recording it canonically for all to see and all to remember. After describing such a lavishing and promising start, the prophets then abruptly shift to a scene several years later where they depict God as the aggrieved husband dealing with his wayward, idolatrous wife. God is furious at the betrayal of his chosen people who have committed idolatrous adultery by worshiping other gods and abandoning many of the key terms of the covenant. God laments the lost promise of covenant love with his chosen bride. He laments even more that Israel was sacrificing their children, literally, as Jeremiah says, in consigning their firstborn to the altar as a gift to Baal, metaphorically, in cutting off their descendants from the covenant by not teaching them to observe the law of the covenant. God repeatedly threatens and then files for divorce, as is his right under the law of the covenant. But then God repents of his anger, returns to his covenant with Israel, and promises anew his everlasting love, if for no other reason than for the sake of the children and the children's children. The prophet Ezekiel gave this covenant marriage metaphor its most graphic and elaborate expression, writing as he did right in the midst of Israel's exile in Babylon, and trying to explain why the people were suffering so in this bondage away from their home. Ezekiel begins by depicting God dreamily recounting the birth of Israel, her puberty, their happy courtship, betrothal, wedding day, and happy cohabitation, only to be devastated by Israel's infidelity. Listen to one of the many emotional passages in Ezekiel, this one in chapter 16. This is God talking. I passed by you again and looked on you. You were at the age of love. I spread the edge of my cloak over you and covered your nakedness. I pledged myself to you and entered into a covenant with you, says the Lord God, and you became mine. Then I bathed you with water and washed off the blood from you and anointed you with oil. I clothed you with embroidered cloth and with sandals of fine leather. I bound you in fine linen and covered you with rich fabric. I adorned you with ornaments. I put bracelets on your arms, a chain on your neck, a ring in your nose, earrings in your ears, a beautiful crown on your head. You were adorned with gold and silver, while your clothing was of fine linen, rich fabric, embroidered cloth. You had choice flour and honey and oil for food. You grew exceedingly beautiful, fit to be my queen. Your fame spread among the nations on account of your beauty, for it was perfect because of my splendor that I bestowed on you, says the Lord God. But you trusted in your beauty and played the whore because of your fame, and lavished your whorings on any passerby. And on this narrative goes with the same raw emotion imputed to God. Ezekiel devotes many chapters thereafter to documenting Israel's betrayal of the law of God and her union with false gods and foreign peoples. Ezekiel's running metaphor eventually shifts to a divorce court, where God, the aggrieved husband, presents evidence against his wife Israel, whose idolatry and ritual uncleanness has led to her necessary repudiation and exile now in Babylon. But eventually, Ezekiel says, God forgives his wayward pride and promises her a new covenant of peace. He promises that despite her unfaithfulness and exile, Israel will soon come home, and the Lord will be there, waiting as a faithful and forgiving husband waits for his wayward wife. This same pattern of courtship and marriage, betrayal, divorce, and eventual reconciliation between God and Israel recurs in Hosea, Jeremiah, and Isaiah. These early prophets all use this marriage metaphor for anthropomorphic reasons. They cast in graphic human and emotional terms that everyone could understand what it must feel like to God to be betrayed by his beloved chosen people. The prophets thereby hope to shake the wayward people from sin and bring them back to covenant faithfulness. Malachi the last of these prophets to use this covenant metaphor in his mid-5th century BCE text, repeats the story of marriage formation, betrayal, and reconciliation, but then he drew direct lessons for human marriages as well. In his first chapter, Malachi starts out the same way as the other earlier prophets had done, depicting God's angry lamentation about Israel's infidelity. This time it was their many ritual impurities and fraudulent sacrifices that ran contrary to the covenant. God lashes out angrily at this latest act of infidelity. I will rebuke your offspring and spread dung upon your faces, the dung of your offerings, and I'll put you and your children out of my presence. But then in chapter 2, Malachi flipped this covenant marital metaphor on its head, using it to offer moral instructions about human marriages. Here's what he says in verses 12 to 16 of chapter 2. You cover the Lord's altar with tears, with weeping and groaning, because he no longer regards the offering and accepts it with favor of your hand. You ask, why does he not? Because the Lord was witness to the covenant between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have been faithless, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. Has not the one God made and sustained for us the spirit of life? And what does he require? Godly offspring. So take heed to yourselves, and let none be faithless to the wife of his youth. For I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel, and covering one's garments with violence, says the Lord, the God of hosts. So take heed to yourselves, and do not be faithless. There's an awful lot packed into this passage, and it's long been an exegetical battleground amongst biblical scholars and exegetes whose pay grade is far in excess of mine. But most important for our more pedestrian purposes this evening is how this running covenant metaphor in Malachi and in the other earlier prophets holds major lessons for human marriage. There's a book in this, but let me just point out 5 main teachings that stand out, each of them echoed, albeit more briefly, in the New Testament. First, the covenant metaphor confirms the created form of marriage as a monogamous union between one man and one woman. Even God, who had the perfect right to pick as many brides as he wished, chose only one bride, his beloved Israel, with whom to produce godly descendants. The Malachi 2 passage just quoted ties this norm directly to the primordial creation story of Genesis 1 and 2. At creation, God could have created 2 or more wives for Adam, but he chose to create one. God could have created 3 or 4 types of humans to be the image of God, but he created 2 types. Male and female, he created them. In the law, God could have commanded his people to worship 2 or more gods, but he commanded them to worship one God. Marriage as an order of creation and an image of God's relationship with his people involves 2 spouses, no more. Second, the covenant metaphor confirms that God participates in each marriage. The passage in Malachi again underscores this, echoing the story of creation. Just as God gave Adam and Eve the spirit of life and brought them together, so God gives each man and each woman a spirit of love and witnesses and solemnizes their union. God is not only the creator of the institution of marriage, Malachi makes clear, God is also the witness to each marriage. His presence and testimony legitimates the formation of each new marital covenant that follows prescribed forms and norms. God is also the guarantor of the marriage, on whom the couple can call to ensure that the terms of their marital contract are fulfilled. And God is the exemplar of marriage, as he shows in his covenant marriage with the bride of Israel. To enter into a marriage, the prophets teach, is to enter into a new relationship not only with one's spouse, but also with God. God may be present in the marital relationship in various ways, later interpreters would make clear. Through parents or peers or pastors who represent divine authority and priesthood. Through neighbors, congregants, and community members who represent divine hospitality and support. Through children, grandchildren, or kinfolk who represent God's natural gifts and blessings. But the main point is that marriage is not a private union, but a public commitment supported by sundry relationships in which and by which God is present. Third, the covenant metaphor confirms the procreative function of marriage. Even God, who had the power to create as many faithful followers as he wished, for as many generations as he wanted, chose instead to produce godly seed through his chosen bride Israel. This too echoes the creation story, where God delegates the power of creating the next generation of humans to Adam and to Eve, calling them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Covenant marriage underscores this procreative purpose of marriage, but it also makes clear, as Malachi highlights, that married couples are called to produce not just any children, but godly offspring, the next generation who are faithful. The marital covenant makes procreation an extraordinary responsibility. It is a sharing with God in the creation and nurture of a new image bearer and a new covenant follower of God on earth, a responsibility that stays with parents for as long as they and their children live. Fourth, the covenant metaphor confirms the divine laws governing marriage formation, as set out both in the Mosaic law and in the natural law written in the hearts of all persons. Even God, who had the perfect right to take whatever bride, by whatever means he wanted, obeys his own laws for proper courtship and marriage. He chooses his spouse carefully and takes time in courting and getting to know her. He seeks her consent and that of her father Abraham. He provides her with engagement and wedding gifts. He rehearses for her the terms of the marital covenant before their wedding day so that they both understand what they're getting into. And the couple then celebrates their covenant union in an elaborate public ceremony and public exchange of vows before the whole community with an authorized official, Moses, presiding. The metaphorical story of God's covenant with Israel, as told by the prophets, cleverly underscores the very Mosaic laws of marital formation that the covenanted people of Israel were required to follow. And it goes not just to the letter of these laws, but also to the spirit. You have the right to divorce, but you don't necessarily have to exercise it. You have the right to buy a spouse effectively by a marital gift to their father. This story illustrates, give gifts to your fiancé and your bride alike, and other illustrations could follow. Fifth, the covenant metaphor makes clear that each marital covenant between husband and wife is part and product of a much larger covenant relationship between God and humanity. Both the husband and the wife must be faithful to this covenant, Malachi 2 makes clear. This is a new egalitarian trajectory. The earlier prophets, echoing the Genesis account of humanity's fall into sin through the failings of Eve, have always focused on Israel, the wayward wife, the adulteress who had gone after other gods and had produced illegitimate children, bastards, who could not be supported and would have to die out. That image of the fallen woman comes through as late as Proverbs, a book produced a century before the book of Malachi. Proverbs 2, for example, reads, "You will be saved from the loose woman, from the adventuress with her smooth words, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God." Malachi turns the tables and focuses on the husband too, calling him to be faithful to his wife just as God was faithful to Israel. For a husband to wander after another woman, whether a lover, prostitute, or concubine, is now not just an act of adultery. It is an act of blasphemy, an insult to the divine example of covenant marriage that God maintained in exemplary fashion with Israel. Husbands are now to follow God's example of offering covenant love to their wives, remaining faithful to them even in the face of violence or trouble or betrayal. Husbands are also to follow God's example in living by both the letter and the spirit of the traditional law of divorce. There's still a place for divorce in cases of deep rupture of the relationship. God hates divorce, Malachi says, but God does not prohibit it. Instead, God calls husbands not to divorce lightly on grounds of mere uncleanness, as Deuteronomy 24 had allowed, nor should they divorce harshly, covering their garments with violence, as Malachi 2 puts it. To breach one's marital covenant lightly or violently, Malachi teaches, is tantamount to breaching one's covenant with God. For those who do so, God no longer regards or accepts their offerings or worship, a sign of divine condemnation. In Malachi's formulation, marriage has now become part of one's religious duty, part of living in covenant community, part of one's expression of true covenant love of God, neighbor, and self alike. These same Hebrew Bible lessons about the covenant of marriage recur in the New Testament. Both Jesus and Paul repeat and condone the created structure of marriage as a one-flesh union between a man and a woman, designed for their mutual affection and support and mutual procreation of children. Jesus himself participates in the wedding at Cana, performing his first miracle there, thereby incarnating and dramatizing God's own participation in forming a marriage. Jesus further uses the image of a public wedding feast repeatedly to illustrate the coming of the kingdom of God and the union of God and his elect. Both Jesus and Paul confirm the procreative purpose of marriage, the natural and spiritual good of producing godly offspring who exemplify the true faith and piety that become the Christian life. Both Jesus and Paul further underscore the importance of each person's and each parent's and the broader community's responsibility to protect and nurture and educate, catechize and protect children. Jesus reserves a special place in hell for those who would harm or mislead children. Jesus and St. Paul may have hated divorce too, but they did allow it in cases of fundamental betrayal of the body through adultery, per Matthew 19, or of the soul, per 1 Corinthians 7. And the New Testament stresses the new mutuality of marriage. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul instructed the husband and wife alike to have equal regard for the rights and needs of the others, including, importantly, the other's sexual and bodily needs. He writes, because of the temptation to immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to the wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not rule over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not rule over his own body, but the wife does. This important passage echoes the Hebrew Bible in commending sex and intimacy to marital couples, but it goes beyond it in pressing this ethic in egalitarian terms. The Mosaic Law was male-centered. For example, the Mosaic Law provided that each new husband should get an exemption from military service to be, quote, free at home 1 year to be happy with the wife whom he has married. Rejoice in the wife of your youth, the ancient proverb echoes. May her breasts satisfy you at all times. May you be intoxicated always with her love. A sensual admonition underscored by whole chapters of steamy sexuality in the Song of Songs and Proverbs. But all these passages in the Hebrew Bible are focused on the husband, and some are blatantly misogynist. Malachi had already turned the tables on husbands and pressed for a more egalitarian understanding of the marital covenant. Paul widens this egalitarian trajectory in 1 Corinthians 7. And then Ephesians 5 elaborates this further still in its call for mutual sacrifice and love between husband and wife in imitation of the mysterious sacrificial union of Christ and his church. So the biblical teaching of marriage as a covenant highlights a number of key elements of marital lore and marital law that have had enduring provenance in the Western tradition. Together they form something of a biblical phenomenology of marriage. There are a number of key elements. Let me just focus on a few of them. First of all, consent, the voluntary participation by both parties in the formation of this union. Second, courtship, the need to take time to negotiate the pending merger of lives, identities, properties, families, names. Third, monogamy, the expected commitment to one spouse and one spouse only. Fourth, publicity, the broader families and communities' involvement in marriage formation, maintenance, and dissolution. Fifth, ritual, the dramatic enactment of marriage at a properly officiated wedding feast with a unique liturgy attached in which the couple, their families, and sometimes the whole community participate. Sixth, celebration, the jubilant feasts that attach to a new marriage, to an anniversary of the same, and to children born of the same. Seventh, gifts, the reciprocal material exchanges, not only between the couple and their families, but also the gifts by the broader community to help establish this new marital household. Eighth, equality, the expected ethic of equal regard and respect for one's fiancé and one's spouse. Ninth, mutuality, the loving sacrifices each party is expected to make for the legitimate needs of one's spouse, even if that spouse can't reciprocate anymore by reason of sickness or injury or incapacity. 10th, communication, the mutual sharing by husband and wife of sex and intimacy, of domestic labor and household economics. 11th, procreation, the joint investment of both the mother and father in the nurture, protection, and education of their children, often aided by broader kin networks. 12th, fidelity, the unique sacrificial loyalty that is expected to one's spouse, children, parents, and kin. 13th, presumptive permanence, and the stability and trust and reliance and expectation that induces in the couple, their children, their community. 14th, accountability, the need to answer for one's grave marital faults, first to one's spouse, but also to authorities who represent the broader community's interest in the health, safety, and stability of the marital household. 15th, reconciliation, the invitation to forgive, if possible, the faults of one's spouse, especially for the sake of children. 16th, dissolubility, the recognition that marriage covenants have built into them conditions of mutual performance, whose chronic and pervasive breach can result in divorce. And finally, immutability, the notion that even after divorce or death, the status of marriage stays with each person and obligates them to give ongoing support to their ex-spouse, to their children, to their grandchildren, both through this life and by testamentary means as after death. Together, these biblical elements of the marriage covenant were designed to confirm and elevate and integrate the natural inclinations and rational reflections on marriage that other ancient peoples had already offered on this vital institution. Together, these elements were designed to make marriage a more effective, reliable, loving, egalitarian, and attractive association for the couple and their children. And together, these covenant elements were designed to provide the religious community and broader society with a stable household whose flourishing was deemed to be of critical importance to the health of the broader community. Christians over the centuries have incorporated these covenantal ideals and elements of marriage into the personal ethics of believers and into the spiritual lives of their church communities. The many biblical passages on marriage and the marital covenant have provided endless inspiration for sermons and catechisms, confessional and pastoral handbooks, and many other forms of moral instruction for marriage and family life and sexual expression. Moreover, Christians have translated these covenantal ideals into internal religious norms for church discipline and external civil norms for the state and for the broader society, particularly the Reformed tradition since the 16th century, inspired by the pioneering work of John Calvin and Heinrich Bullinger, Martin Bucer, and a whole series of Anglo-American Puritan divines in the 17th century, used the idea of marriage as a covenant to build a complex, comprehensive new family law for the West to replace the medieval canon law that had been predicated on the idea of marriage as a sacrament. These views helped to shape the West's legal understanding that marriage is not only a contract, but is also a covenant. Marriage, the Western legal tradition has long taught, is one of the great mediators of individuality and community, of revelation and reason, of tradition and modernity. Marriage is at once a harbor of the self and a harbinger of the community, a symbol of divine love and a structure of reasoned consent, an enduring ancient mystery and a constantly modern invention. The recent covenant marriage laws that we began with go further than simple contract marriage laws in reflecting and protecting some of these higher dimensions of marriage. In this, these new covenant marriage laws serve a valuable teaching function in America today, instructing the community on the higher regard that the state has for marriage, instructing the couple of the higher rigor that marriage has for them, inviting religious communities to take into account the higher calling that they have to uphold the spiritual dimensions of marriage. And they do all this consistent with the First Amendment prohibition against establishment of any religion by law, by focusing on the structural features rather than on the biblical pedigree of the covenant of marriage. But the modern covenant marriage movement has two Achilles heels today, which has rendered it not only a limping response to our modern crisis of marriage, but ultimately a movement that cannot yet get off the ground. The one Achilles heel is the state law, and in particular a technical issue of conflict of laws. Outside of the three states of Louisiana, Arkansas, and Arizona that have covenant marriage options, states will not recognize covenant marriage, only contract marriage. And a estranged spouse can thus escape a covenant marriage simply by moving to and filing for divorce in any one of the 47 other American states. And current conflict of laws rules do not favor the enforcement of covenant marriage laws over the contract marriage laws of the forum state where the divorce case is being litigated. So if you're in Louisiana and you're married in a covenant marriage and you want to get a divorce, you drive across the state boundary into Texas, exist there for 3 months, file for divorce in a Texas state court, and the Texas state court will apply Texas contract marriage law to deal with the dissolution of your covenant marriage contracted in Louisiana. So these unfavorable conflict of law rules, as we call them, haven't yet been strongly tested in court, but they underscore the reality that covenant marriage laws remain an innovative but necessarily incomplete legal response to the fallout of the modern sexual and divorce revolution, whose pathos we tried to document a bit in a few raw statistics. The second Achilles heel is the modern church. Too many modern churches have lost their traditional role as moral exemplars of covenant marriage and covenant living. Look at the numbers. The rates of non-marital cohabitation, of adultery, of extramarital sex, of divorce, of wife abuse, of child abuse, of pornography consumption, and many other indicia of sexual pathos are roughly the same in most Christian churches compared to the average in society. And in some communities, they're actually higher than the average. Too many churches have lost their capacity to engage the hard legal, political, and social issues of our day with doctrinal rigor, with moral clarity, with canonical authenticity. Too many Christians today are marching to the culture wars with very little ammunition, substituting nostalgia for engagement, acerbity for prophecy, platitudes for principled argument, bumper sticker issues for holistic reformations of law, politics, and society. In centuries past, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant churches alike produced massive codes of religious law and discipline that covered many areas of public and private life, not least, and very importantly for them, sex, marriage, and family lives of their faithful. They instituted sophisticated tribunals for the internal equitable enforcement of these religious laws. They produced exquisite works of theology and jurisprudence that worked out the precepts of proper domestic living in great detail. They produced learned prophets with the learning and capacity and standing in the community to articulate realistic responses to the needs of society as well as the needs of the church. Some of that sophisticated legal work still goes on amongst some religious communities today. And a growing cadre of Christian jurists and theologians and ethicists are re-engaging the hard questions holistically. But the legal structure and institutional sophistication of modern American churches are a pale shadow of what went on before. And their marital norms and habits are increasingly devolving into simple, quaint variations on the cultural and legal status quo. American religious communities must think much more seriously about restoring and reforming their own bodies of religious law on marriage, divorce, and sexuality, instead of simply acquiescing in thinner and thinner state laws and permissive culture. The biblical doctrine of covenant provides one strong foundation for that exercise. American states, in turn, must think much more seriously about granting greater deference to the marital laws and customs of legitimate religious and cultural groups that cannot accept a marriage law of the common denominator or common denomination. If we get our houses in order, we can imagine a generation or two from now that marriage and family life will be governed much like education is governed today, with public and private options and religious communities given the opportunity to exercise their private options, with basic licensing rules being the equivalent of accreditation rules in education, but allowing religious communities, for their voluntary faithful, to engage in deeper reflection on what the institution of marriage means, to set firmer marital dissolution and marital formation rules, and to engage in a holistic communal participation in the maintenance of this vital institution. That might ultimately be where we Christians have to come out in 2050 or 2060, when we will be decidedly minorities in this culture and can no longer depend upon the state to do our bidding. Thank you so very much.